Of course, the reason for that, of course, is that the KLA has been fighting on the border with the Serbs, and the Serbs have cleared out all the villages around there, and we're told they're all burned and razed to the ground. So we don't know what we're going to find well inside Kosovo, or just a few kilometers inside Kosovo when we come across the first villages, but we can only imagine they'll just be ghost towns.
Ross Appleyard for now, thank you.
NATO is ruling out any partition of Kosovo, but the message from Moscow, where talks have been taking place, is less clear. The US Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, hasn't been able to resolve the problem of Russian troops occupying parts of Pristina airport.
The standoff continues. NATO's relentless advance through Kosovo halted at Pristina airport, where Russian forces hold out, demanding their own command structure and zone of control. In Moscow, the US envoy Strobe Talbot has been in intensive talks to try and overcome the deadlock. Progress has been slow, but his language is conciliatory.
Russia should have an area in which its responsibility is manifest, evident for all the world to see. That is not only a legitimate objective, it's an objective that the United States supports as well.
But Britain insists Russian troops come under the unified command of KFOR's General Sir Mike Jackson. Ministers here have been lining up to say they will not tolerate partitioning.
All troops coming into Kosovo as part of the Kosovo peacekeeping force have to be part of an integrated unit. They cannot have an independent operation following an independent policy, either military or towards the civilian population.
The Russians and NATO are in favour of one Kosovo and oppose partition.
Britain warns that a Russian zone would inflame the KLA, but critics say the crisis is of NATO's own making.
Why didn't we anticipate the Russians would do something of this kind? What intelligence gathering went on? Why did we not know that they were in the course of making a dash, as it were, for Pristina?
The Kremlin, though, has promised to send in no further troops, and Presidents Yeltsin and Clinton will talk by phone. The hope is that this stumbling block will not be allowed to wreck the peace. John Ray, Sky News.
These are the headlines this Sunday lunchtime. A combat between the Russian forces and NATO continues at the airport. Diplomacy continuing. President Clinton due to speak to President Yeltsin later today to try and resolve the issue. Let's now look at the latest developments. This report from Tim Friend.
The wrangle may be continuing over who controls what in Pristina, but still NATO forces roll into Kosovo. These Italian vehicles are on the road to Prizren. Thousands of refugees were held there by the Serbs before being expelled. NATO has warned its soldiers to expect graphic evidence of ethnic cleansing, and these troops are prepared for the worst. And the Germans are on the road too, crossing the border from Albania, also heading for Prizren. The jubilation among the refugees is obvious, and the bitterness against the Serbs no less clear. A former Serb border post is attacked. Their troops are now on their way out of Kosovo. The atmosphere on the Albania-Kosovo border has changed overnight. Now the Serbs, not the refugees, are making an exit, watched all the way by NATO helicopters. Tim Friend, Sky News.
Yeah, with Sky News today, still to come, all the latest.
German troops rolled over the border of Albania and Kosovo, but this time they're on a peacekeeping mission. Looting began at the border post as soon as local people realized the Serbs had left. Just seconds after the border was opened, local people crossed, stealing anything they could get their hands on, even broken down tractors, which were used to bring the refugees into Albania in the first place. Piles of number plates ripped from refugees' cars litter the road. Some Serb soldiers were left behind. They looked confused and angry. There was confusion too on the other side of the border, where the road had been blocked by journalists trying to cross into Kosovo. As the Yugoslav flag was pulled down and burned by angry refugees, the Serbs said they'd shoot us all if it were not for NATO. The German battalion will meet up with its tanks inside Kosovo to blaze a trail to Prizren. It was from there that thousands of people were forced to walk to the border. The job of these NATO soldiers will be to clear a path for the refugees to return. A path littered with the ordnance of war and ethnic cleansing. Ross Appleyard, Sky News, Kosovo.
The headlines on Sky News today: a convoy of British armoured vehicles has driven through the centre of the Kosovo capital Pristina as tensions continue between NATO and Russian troops at the airport. The Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, told Sky News he's confident a solution will be found.
British paratroopers are securing villages around Kosovo as the military build-up continues. They're searching for Serb forces still in the province and continuing to check for booby traps and mines.
And a German battalion has entered Kosovo, bolstering NATO's military presence in the province. A column of about 60 vehicles crossed the border from Albania this morning.
The wrangle may be continuing over who controls what in Pristina, but still NATO forces roll into Kosovo. These Italian vehicles are on the road to Prizren. Thousands of refugees were held there by the Serbs before being expelled. NATO has warned its soldiers to expect graphic evidence of ethnic cleansing, and these troops are prepared for the worst. And the Germans are on the road too, crossing the border from Albania, also heading for Prizren. The jubilation among the refugees is obvious, and the bitterness against the Serbs no less clear. A former Serb border post is attacked. Their troops are now on their way out of Kosovo. The atmosphere on the Albania-Kosovo border has changed overnight. Now the Serbs, not the refugees, are making an exit, watched all the way by NATO helicopters. Tim Friend, Sky News.
All day we've been reporting live from the Kosovan capital, Pristina. Our correspondents there have been telling us about the situation at the airport and also continuing tensions on the streets. Reports that several Serb policemen were killed in a gunfight earlier today. And Jeremy Thompson, you have news of further problems.
Yeah, well, an interesting one, and perhaps NATO's first insertion here, first attempt at sorting out some local difficulties on the ground. As you may remember that earlier I was saying on the other side of Pristina, we're on the of Pristina, we're on the western side, up on the hills to the east. We had seen smoke rising from one of the suburbs there, and the military here, the NATO military, had certainly heard that there was some sort of confrontation between the KLA, with their troops coming down from the mountains where they have bases outside Pristina, and local members of MUP, the Serbian military police. And it's understood that there were possibly as many as 3 Serb police deaths. We then heard a short time ago that the KLA had taken hostage one officer of the Yugoslav army and one officer of the MUP, the military police. But we've just heard that NATO, on hearing that news, went straight up there with a patrol. Apparently the KLA had said that they wanted NATO to sort it out, otherwise they would take justice into their own hands. NATO were swift to get themselves up there and intervene, and apparently they have defused that situation. They have managed to get the release of the police and the soldier from the Serbian forces. That situation has now been calmed down, and apparently there was no bloodshed and no loss of life. So I'm sure NATO will see that as a good, positive early sign that they are capable of keeping the two sides apart and defusing tension. One other thing that's interesting here in the last few minutes is that the Hussars and Royal Artillery, who are behind me here, have just spotted on the hill about possibly less than a mile away, right up on the hill. It's difficult for us to see, but a Yugoslav army artillery piece, a tank up there with anti-tank capability, and they've checked through the binoculars. They can see that it's trained its sights on this particular command post. Nothing hostile at the moment, but just coming back to where we are here, the Challengers, Warriors and Scimitars around here. It's the Challenger 1 from the King's Royal Hussars. They've turned their turret so that they can keep a pretty good eye. So it's a bit of an eyeball to eyeball. The soldiers here believe that the Yugoslav army are just interested, just wanting to keep an eye on what's going on down here. and at the moment no sign of any hostile intention, but they're taking no chances, got their turrets turned in the right direction, and just making sure that they've got it.
There have been running battles between NATO soldiers and the Serb forces who remain in this village of Qershor just across the border. On this occasion, NATO was forced to bring in the heavy weapons to push the Serb soldiers back who'd just charged up the street. There are thousands of Serb soldiers left in the province. Most begrudge the presence of NATO. The jubilation of local Albanians, now free from an oppressive regime, appears to be more than they can bear. Ross Appleyard, Sky News, Prizren in Kosovo.
Ross, we'd all been led to believe that those Serb troops from the sort of southwest corner, neighbouring Albania, should have been on the move long ago. What seems to have gone wrong there? They not got the message?
They certainly have not got the message, and they're still here, they're still angry, and they're still armed, and still very, very menacing. As we drove through the border, there was some confusion this morning as we left Albania and to drive into Kosovo. We should have had an armed escort from the Germans. That didn't seem to happen. We were allowed through the border, and we drove along the road on our own, with, which was lined by Serb troops, and I can tell you it was a frightening experience. And when we got here on the outskirts of Prizren, we found that local Serb people who were trying to flee were being attacked by local people from here, and the Serb troops took umbrage at this, despite the fact there were KFOR troops here. The Germans had come up from Macedonia and they had tanks here, but when the Serb soldiers ran to the aid of the Serb civilians, they confronted KFOR troops, and we had these terrible scenes, only stopped by the German commander, who waded in amongst it and told everyone to cool down. He managed to avert what could have been a real tragedy. There were shots fired, and when you stand in Albania week after week and hear the stories of the atrocities that the Serb army soldiers and the police have caused, when you see them running towards you, I can tell you it's an extremely frightening ordeal.
Ross, what are the KFOR commanders there planning to do about this? How are they going to resolve this situation and try and get the Serb withdrawal underway?
I have no idea. I don't know what they can do about it other than physically threaten them. They just seem to be sitting at the side of the road, fully armed and prepared to use their weapons, as we've seen there, earlier today. I don't know what KFOR can do apart from move in heavy troops. They had to bring in armoured personnel carriers with large machine guns on the top to avert a dramatic situation this afternoon, and the whole situation seems to have quietened down now. But as for getting these Serb troops out, I have no idea how they're going to do that. They were right up at the border and lined the border all the way from Albania right into Prizren, a distance of some 20 kilometres.
Ross, apart from all those problems, have you had any sight or contact with the KLA since you crossed over?
No, not at all. I mean, the only connection I've seen about the KLA are the people here shouting Qershor, which is the way they describe the KLA locally. I mean, I have to say that now the mood has changed dramatically. If you sort of look up this street, the soldiers up here, most of them have been given flowers. They've been chanted at every time a car comes past. They have, cheers and shouting of NATO, NATO. The people here are more than relieved to see these soldiers. But then, of course, you have to consider that many of these people that you see now, this is the first light of day they've had for almost 3 months. Many of them have stayed in their basements, in their houses, anywhere they can to hide from the Serb soldiers. So this is the first time they've actually been allowed out, and to see friendly forces on the streets with their own weapons against the Serb forces, and to actually witness KFOR protecting them against the Serb forces for the first time in a long time has come as a massive relief to these people.
Ross Appleyard in Prizren, right over there in the southwest of Kosovo. Well, you can hear the advance of the NATO troops all around me, tanks rolling in all the time, but Serb troops have, of course, been returning home from Kosovo and have been greeted as heroes. Citizens have been out on the streets of Serbia to cheer their troops home. Jeff Mead reports from the Serbian capital, Belgrade.
Hailed as heroes, Serbian state TV showed the first substantial withdrawal from Kosovo as Yugoslav army trucks carrying troops and towing anti-tank weapons pulled out of the southern province. On the thronged streets of Rashka, 40 miles north of Pristina, children tossed flowers to relieved-looking soldiers, though glummer faces among the crowd suggested adults recognized the climb down behind government propaganda claiming these men had triumphed by preserving Yugoslavia's borders. And in a foretaste of potential unrest ahead, the unit's commander hinted that cuts in the army budget may have curtailed their resistance. "We did what we could," he said, "with the equipment the government allowed us." In Kraljevo, an armoured brigade rolled through the city, tank crews returning civilians' cheers with the Serb three-digit victory salute. Not a retreat, insists the government, but an agreed handover to UN peacekeepers. The word NATO barely mentioned in the official media, lest it concede success to the alliance's 11 weeks of bombing. By night, too, the exodus went on, movement that would have been fatally reckless while NATO ruled the skies. These armoured vehicles returning to base and waiting loved ones. "My boy's a hero," said this joyous father. He's now survived 3 wars, inadvertently confirming Belgrade's forces' involvement in Bosnia and Croatia before that. This is Požarevac, eastern Serbian birthplace of Slobodan Milosevic. But even here, the euphoria may soon give way to questions about the conduct of the war and whether the troops who won't be returning were sacrificed in vain. Jeff Mead, Sky News, Belgrade.
Well, my colleague Tim Marshall, who was with us here this morning in Pristina, is now on his way back to Belgrade after spending the last week here. He's just north of Niš on the road in towards Belgrade. What have you been seeing along the road, Tim?
Well, quite heartbreaking sights of Serb civilians fleeing the chaos that all my colleagues in the various parts of Kosovo have been describing. We understand that a Serbian refugee column has been fired upon by a KLA unit and there have been deaths. We've got stuck in various columns of refugees as they flooded out of Kosovo. I think it's only in the thousands, it's not yet in the tens of thousands. Some people are sitting tight and waiting to see if NATO can protect them. But they're flooding out of Kosovo up into Serbia itself, and you have to wonder, they don't know where they're going, but what happens whenever they get there? They'll be very angry, very bitter, and they'll feel very betrayed. And their presence, if it becomes a flood, could alter the dynamics of the politics of this country. As we left Pristina itself, our car has Belgrade number plates, and therefore was immediately identified as a Serb car. As we drove up through the northern suburbs, where the Albanians had come out in large numbers to greet the NATO troops, there was a lot of warriors stationed up in the north of the city. And as we drove through with 1 or 2 other cars full of Serbs, men were stepping forward to try and kick the cars, people were spitting at us, people jeering and waving goodbye to what they thought were more Serb refugees. And the mood has turned a lot uglier. I listened with interest to what Andrew Wilson said. He's right about the next 48 hours, but I think tonight will be very, very tense indeed, and NATO needs to get the infantry onto the streets.
It's port. They might be able to bring stuff up by rail, but that's not certain. The rail link from Thessalonica to here is not operating properly at the moment. So you've got to bring it all in to, say, Macedonia, and then bring the supplies in here. If they could do it by air, it would help. But really, at the moment, that's not a problem because all the supplies came in with the forces. The real problem for NATO at the moment is that they're being made to look a bit silly. They made this great claim that they would come to Pristina airport. The leader of NATO forces said that he would hold a sort of triumphant news conference there, and instead last night, as it was getting dark, in the pouring rain, he held a news conference courtesy of the Russians, made a very brief statement, refused to answer questions and walked off into the gloom, quite clearly somewhat embarrassed by it all. So what the Russians are doing, having been the butt of a lot of derision from the West for some time, and particularly their military, they are milking this for all it's worth, and they're making President Clinton and I imagine Tony Blair squirm as well.
And making the NATO forces pretty disheartened as well. They seem pretty disappointed to have come second.
Documents could be in refugee camps in Albania and Macedonia. The Serb plan was to turn them into non-persons, unable to ever reclaim homes or land.
As refugees left Kosovo, they were stripped of all their documentation so they couldn't prove citizenship, and clearly alarm bells rang in that direction, although we haven't proved it at all. That's probably for the UNHCR to do. The kind of thing we found were many little individual identity cards like that. possibly a couple of thousand. This is in 2 hours searching, that they were layered so deeply on the ground. And also passports, all of which had been ripped in two to render them invalid.
The evidence will now be passed to the UN Refugee Agency. Eventually, these people could be traced and proof of their identity restored. These Italian vehicles are on the road to Prizren. Thousands of refugees were held there by the Serbs before being expelled. NATO has warned its soldiers to expect graphic evidence of ethnic cleansing, and these troops are prepared for the worst. And the Germans are on the road too, crossing the border from Albania, also heading for Prizren. The jubilation among the refugees is obvious, and the bitterness against the Serbs no less clear. A former Serb border post is attacked. Their troops are now on their way out of Kosovo. The atmosphere on the Albania-Kosovo border has changed overnight. Now the Serbs, not the refugees, are making an exit, watched all the way by NATO helicopters. Tim Friend, Sky News.
Doucet with a summary of the world news. British paratroopers in Kosovo with the NATO-led peace force have shot dead a man who opened fire at them in the capital, Pristina. It was not immediately known if the dead man was a member of the Serbian military or police, but it's the first reported violence involving NATO peacekeeping troops since they began entering Kosovo on Saturday. According to the British Army spokesman, the paratroopers acted within KFOR's rules of engagement. Meanwhile, intense diplomatic efforts are continuing to try to resolve the...
NATO's KFOR troops moved into the province yesterday morning. Sky's Keith Graves is in the provincial capital.
Seldom in war or peace, and this falls between the two, can a community have experienced such a mix of emotions in such a short time. Joy, hatred, fear, relief, death and defiance. Joy from ethnic Albanians at the arrival of the first NATO troops in Pristina in a deliberate display of power designed to reassure people who had been living in fear for months, but also a warning to them to reinforce NATO's message that they will not stand for retribution against the Serb community. And the message will need to be pressed home, because death came to this member of the hated paramilitary police at the hands of an Albanian lynch mob. And he was not the only one to die this way as NATO moved in to impose law and order. The Serb forces are not leaving with their tails between their legs. As Albanians were welcoming NATO troops, paramilitary Serbs, motto "Born to Kill," drove defiantly and provocatively through the crowd. They were seen off by a British tank. Nearby, Serb policemen petrol bombed Pristina's oldest mosque in broad daylight as they withdrew from the city, filled with hatred to the end. With plans to ensure the two sides did not come into contact gone out of the window, clashes are inevitable. The shooting tonight of a paramilitary policeman who threatened a paratrooper was the first violent clash.
Given the fact that there are now half a dozen armed groups, official and irregulars, operating in and around Pristina, more such incidents are inevitable. Keith Graves, Sky News, Pristina.
Earlier today, when we heard that a couple of German journalists had been shot, one shot dead, one critically injured, just about 20 miles south of here, they were with Canadian peacekeepers, so more tragic news on another day in Kosovo.
An awful lot of what a variety of a mixture of people who individually have a different axe to grind quite often. It's difficult to know what the target's going to be.
Very much so, Bob. It is at the moment a very confused and angry and fearful city in many ways, and I'm sure the same applies across the countryside in every direction out of Pristina itself. We have angry and very anxious Serb community, some heading, as you've heard from Tim Marshall earlier in the day, out across the border into Greater Serbia itself. But maybe 100,000 Serbs are staying put to see what NATO will do, to see whether they can make their lives reasonably secure here. But they are fearful that now is the time that the Albanian community, led by the KLA, may choose to take revenge for what has been happening in the previous months. And certainly we have heard that the KLA have moved down from the mountains, certainly towards the eastern fringe of Pristina, and there have been some confrontations between departing Serbs, both civilian and military, and KLA groups. As you heard earlier in the day, I think one or two of those confrontations, NATO managed to intervene and calm them down, but where they haven't been, there have certainly been flare-ups between the two communities, as expected. We also have the Albanian community still hiding in many parts of the country, where the NATO peacekeepers are still making their way towards them, hoping to make their lives a bit more livable. So two communities still in some confusion, some on their way out, some on their way into the country, and NATO steadily making their way across country to try and stabilize the situation.
Jeremy, before the...
KFOR troops came face to face with the Serbs in an ugly confrontation when they were charged by armed soldiers. Shots were fired in the incident, which happened after local people attacked Serb civilians trying to flee. The German commandant eventually stepped in to cool the situation down.
We have some trouble with Serbs. Some Serbs are shooting in the air. 10 or 15 Serbs started an attack against the people. They are stopped by the Bundeswehr and going back to their commander. And now the situation is quiet and normal.
There have been running battles between NATO soldiers and the Serb forces who remain in this village of Qershor, just across the border. On this occasion, NATO was forced to bring in the heavy weapons to push the Serb soldiers back, who'd just charged up the street. The Serb forces lined the route from Albania into Prizren, still armed, still menacing. The legacy they leave behind in towns like Prizren will not easily be forgotten.
A nek ne motraj kish pa do marka dhe në qika vlavit ladham qata.